My name is Duane Bushman, everyone. I'm an SBCT. I'm here to talk with you today about hardware agility and safe principles. And this talk, I'll tell you right now in terms of don't feel the need to read every word on the slides. The batch size is a little bit larger than maybe I would have liked for a 40-minute conversation. So there's a lot of stuff here. So I'll be pointing out the highlights and we'll be going through, but we'd like to cover a few things. In any of the training that we go through, quite often we'll hear as we're talking through, yeah, that's for software, but it really doesn't apply to hardware. Nowhere in the big picture do we see hardware except the little HW in the corner, and it really doesn't apply, right? It doesn't apply to us as you're going through and doing the training. And what I'm showing you is Neil Johnson had put up an excerpt that I chose to steal and go through here, but as you're reading these questions, if you answered no to most of these questions, there's a really good chance that you need to consider agility, right? So now let's talk about that aspect, because just like software, we can benefit in the hardware world from applying the principles. The next few words are coming up on here. As we're working with some of the hardware-centric trains that I've worked with in the past and polling them and saying, hey, in 1, 2, 3 words, what's the benefits that you got from what we just did in terms of the last PI or the PI plus 1? And we started hearing things like, hey, we got faster feedback. Wow, the power to change. Earlier risk reduction. Drives simplicity. These are things that, you mean it's not just software that can benefit from all of these great phrases? These were coming from our practitioners, our engineers, our people on the trains. So we've clearly uncovered something, that agility really does apply. But it's not without its differences, right? There's definitely some challenges as we start talking about it. So what are some of the considerations? What are some of those differences that we want to talk about? First off, lead time is longer and cost is greater. Without a doubt, I think we can all agree on that one. It just takes longer when we're doing something cyber-physical, something physical out there. We cannot deliver a partial product. Has anyone said or heard that in the coaching world? We can't deliver a partial product, Duane. There's no way. So I'll throw the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't work, right? And then specialized skills and non-fungible roles, right? It's not just plug and play. It's not like I can have a software engineer do testing and vice versa. I've got mechanical engineers and power engineers and electrical engineers. Those roles aren't fungible. So I'm going to talk about these 3 things here in the next few slides. And how do the principles apply? I know there's a 10th principle now, so these slides were done before that. So 5.0 notwithstanding, this is a 4.6 presentation. But as we look at this, so let's talk about the lead time being longer and what that actually means. Your mileage may vary on some of these reasons. You may or may not agree with all of them. But again, out in the field, what are some of the things we hear? Procurement takes time and it actually limits the number of design iterations because we got to lock in some of our decisions early. It's hard to recover from late changes, right? We can't just turn that spigot on and off. What about regulatory or even obsolescence in hardware or our supply chain with our vendors? Those things have significant impact to us. And the architecture, the high-level implementation needs to be locked down early in the process, right? So what principles apply? So here we'll flip the script a little bit and we'll talk about this. First off, taking an economic view. We need to understand those design trade-offs, the cost equations in there. As we're talking about Don Reinertson's work, and we're looking at whether it be risk reduction or the development cost, whatever it may be, keep them in mind. We want to use things like models to push quality left and iterate. Drive those decisions early before the investment gets too great, right? So if we can learn something going through, that extends from those faster feedback loops. That is going to decrease our overall cost. And it's also going to decrease our risk because we're going through. So by thinking with the economics in mind, that's going to help us with all those informed decisions. When do we go from the digital twin era to a physical, right? When do we make that jump and do that investment? That's an economics conversation. And there's a significant investment that goes there. The other one I like here is Assuming variability and preserving our options. So again, lead time is longer. We all agree on that. That's not something that's in debate, right? As we go through, if we are iterating and say we're going into a POC, or from POC to alpha, or alpha to alpha 2, those are all iterative learning cycles, and when we discover something, it can really have an impact. So this is why we want to make sure we're preserving our options. If it has an impact on things like tooling, if we have to go back and retool, there's a cost built into that. So we have to understand we don't know everything on day one, and this is where we use the fixed versus variable solution intent. Right? So if you guys are practitioners of the framework and you've gone through and done any of the training, you understand that there's certain things that are fixed in what we're doing, right? We just can't go outside the parameter. But then there's a bunch of things in terms of from a set-based design approach that we can actually go through and manage and eliminate at the last responsible moment. That's what this is really saying. The last point is the one that I really want you to look at is using models, and using models in a different way. In terms of if we have a simulator, a model, a digital twin, whatever it may be, but what are we trying to learn from that? What question are we trying to answer as we go through? That's all part of preserving our options. So as we go through and develop that model, it's very specific with the hypothesis. Sometimes we'll be surprised by it. Oh, wasn't expecting that to occur. Other times it's going to go through and validate and allow us to stay on the path, right? And if we can stay on the path, that's going to help to decrease that lead time and the cost. Let's go on to number 2 here. And again, I realize I got a lot of content, so I apologize if I'm moving fast. So we cannot deliver a partial product. So cannot be broken down into features and individually and independently. We need the aggregate. We need the whole in order to do it. What about qualification regulatory testing? We can't just hand off a partial and pass a regulatory test. Right? There's certain aspects that have to be in play. Hardware systems are complex, and we've got a whole bunch of subsystems that we need to interact with. Partial products cannot be tested or delivered to the customer. And then my personal favorite, because I think I probably hear this one the most anytime I'm doing an implementing or a leading or a safe for teams. I see some heads shaking out in the crowd, so this may resonate with you as well. But we cannot deliver a partial product in months, much less 2 weeks. What's this iteration you're talking about in the 2-week cycle? That's crazy talk, Duane. We're hardwared. What don't you understand about that? So what principle would apply, right? What principle? So first off, let's apply systems thinking, right? We understand that we have a significant number of integration points. The interactions are high. So we have to think systemically, otherwise our cost is going to go up, because if we miss some of those integration points, it is going to bite us in the end. Because we will discover them, we just don't want to discover them late. We want to apply agility beyond dev. And this is a little bit different than when we talk about DevOps and some of that cycle. I'm talking about operations. I'm talking about the manufacturing side of the house. How do we then go through and from engineering all the way through industrialization, part procurement, right? So the entire value stream. You heard this morning when Dean was talking about we're extending in 5.0 from a development value stream and we're really looking at that operational value stream. That's what we're talking about now, folks, because we got to be thinking about that larger picture and how we go through and extend that. So that's the systemic or applying systems thinking on the principle. Building incrementally with fast integrated learning cycles. We have to reframe this conversation. So when we have engineers and teams say to us, we can't do it in 2 weeks. Okay, let's reframe it. Let's flip the script and talk about what can we do? What is it that we want to learn? What is it that we want to do for our customer? Remember, our customer is anyone that's consuming your work, right? So how do we then go through and in the next, you don't walk in on an 18-month project on day one and have no idea what to do, right? Teams generally know, okay, I need to do this, 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 this. We've got it in our minds. So let's break that down in an enterprise backlog model and have the epics supported to the capabilities, to the features and the stories that help us get down to a new definition of done in terms of what we're looking at accomplishing. What are we looking to accomplish and share in that time frame? And then number 5, basing the milestones on that objective evaluation of working systems, right? Again, boy, we can't do it in 2 weeks. I can't do a schematic in a 2-week time frame. That's not a working system. So we want to look at, okay, I'm going to introduce a concept in a little bit called a horizon roadmap. And this is something that's been used as some of my clients. As we go through there, the construction milestone versus customer deliverables. And if you think of a construction milestone, these are the things that are meaningful within our engineering organization. These are things that are meaningful within our PMO, right? So they're major milestones that are there for us to make sure we're on the right path. And that becomes part of our objective evaluation. How we get there is bullet point number 2. We have to have that cross-functional design review, all those various areas in play. So that way we truly understand this is the objective evaluation side of the house. Do we have all the people in play that can make sure that we're on the right path? That we're on the right path. And then the number three reason again, the specialized skills and non-fungible. So we have a large number of roles and we can't just plug and play. What about those physical resources and assets? The labs, right? The areas that includes, the lab, the equipment, even manufacturing lines. Are you going to repurpose a current line? Can you repurpose the current line as we start looking at that? What are those aspects that we need to consider? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the testing aspect, but some of these things are not, if I need a work cell, for instance, to test a drive that's running at a certain voltage class and a certain horsepower, and suddenly the delivering team doesn't have the product ready for me to go through and do that, I can't necessarily plug and play a different, I'm just going to take the horsepower and flip it and get the voltage class and realign the work cell. That takes time, right? These are the types of things that we start talking about, specialized skills and non-fungible. And then that also applies to people, right? Especially in the engineering world. I'm a software developer by training, so I learned a lot of this as I went through, a lot of bumps and bruises. You can't necessarily take a power engineer and a mechanical engineer and interchange them, right? They actually chose to do that stuff, right? So we want to understand that. How do we get the most out of the flow through our system, right? The safe house of lean and looking at the principle of flow. Because we do end up with bottlenecking, especially if we have those types of people that could contribute, but often it's in a serial fashion. So what principle applies here? First off, number 6, and I put up here, I don't care whether it's software, firmware, hardware, any kind of team that you put out there, WIP is the number 1 problem we all have. If it's your honey-do list coming up this Saturday, you got too much to do, it's WIP. Because we're trying to do too much. So let's understand that, and let's visualize this stuff, and let's truly reduce our batch sizes and truly lean out. That is going to help us go a long way to flow through our organization. That one's not specific to hardware, folks. The cadence synchronization and cross-domain planning. So that cadence is truly the heartbeat, and the synchronization makes all that work visible, right? Having true backlogs that has everything available. Everything available. And then the cross-functional art pulls all those disparate groups together. Momentarily, I'm going to expand on the hardware silo, and we're going to challenge Dunbar's number a little bit at what it means to truly cross-functionally plan. Because at the end of the day, dependency management and how we have the ability to track and maintain is one of the most important aspects here. We're looking to get ahead of those things that are going to bite us, right? Those dependencies, those integration points. And then finally, I looped or grouped principles 8 and 9 together. If there's one thing as a coach, a transformational coach, that we've learned is we just got to get out of people's way. Set those guardrails and let them go. Set them and let them go. So the teams are going to eliminate that non-value add work if we have a clear path for them. And then the balance of intentional architecture versus the emergent design. Again, allowing the teams, because the specialized skill non-fungible roles, the reason I plunked this in here is they know what it is they must do, right? So what we have to do is just get out of the way, allow them to do that. So let's transition here. I want to show you that roadmap a little bit more. Is Luke still in the room? Luke Holman? All right, so I vetted this with Luke on Saturday, and he does not like my mixed metaphor of horizon and roadmap. So where you see horizon on these slides, think construction, okay? And then maybe I'll make Luke happy by the end of it, but it was already baked in the presentation, so Luke's not here, we won't tell him. So you may have seen this slide in terms of where it's at. Within the framework to date in the training, we've had a solution roadmap. That's something that often takes our epics out about 18 months or 18 to 36 months. This is longer lead. The big challenge with the solution roadmap is it doesn't necessarily resonate down to the engineer level. When you start talking about epics and headlines and things like that, they have to dig in to understand it. We have the PI roadmap, which is better. It's more granular. It gets us down to that feature enabler size that fits into PI, but it's only 3 PIs. So one of the constructs that works well is introducing something that's in between, and this is where I called it the Horizon Roadmap, Construction Roadmap, but consider using it because this helps fill that gap. This helps inform our engineers and our teams, what are those things in our design reviews that are truly important? What are those integration points? It contains those development milestones, and this looks at that long lead time aspects. Because more often than not, if you're launching and you're saying, Duane, that's great, but we only apply this at the, a PI's 10 weeks. That doesn't tell me beyond this, right? So that's what this is starting to attempt to do, is close that gap on true items that say, hey, you need awareness that this is coming. And whether it be from a procurement or vendor relation, or even if it's something that we need to go through within our PMO and understand what some of those longer lead time as we interact with marketing. This helps plug that gap, and it socializes those big rocks. Okay? So as we look at it, it helps us understand how we're going to keep pace across the entire value stream. So again, from that operational side of the house, we can now see what do things look like with that longer lead time. If I need to set up a manufacturing line, I need to understand where you're at in the engineering development cycle. This helps bridge that gap. Okay? And none of this information, by the way, is coming from, I haven't introduced a new backlog or anything like that. We're just making it visibly available so that way we can consume that information. So I'm not introducing anything that requires extraordinary effort. It's information we already have that we're just packaging a little bit differently. And it becomes very meaningful to our teams. This was coming out of, this actual roadmap came out of an INA event, and not just one. It evolved over 3 INAs. So we had people that were really, really passionate about this saying, hey, we gotta fill this gap. And the construction roadmap, or the horizon roadmap as I'm calling it, is what came out of it. So you don't need to read this slide. This is just an example of what it may look like. Okay, so please don't look at the stuff that's in the PI. That was Duane just throwing up some of the safe material, a couple of my own. But the intent is we have those development milestones that are meaningful in your organization. And I threw a couple of silly things up like, hey, I'm going from POC to alpha, alpha to qual to release, because that helps with the communication across organization. And then your mileage may vary, but you can see I'm extending this out several PIs. So you do what makes sense. And it lives between a PI roadmap that's that feature-centric versus the solution roadmap that has the epics that are out there. Okay? All right, let's talk a little bit about the roles and the art composition. Who's taken any kind of safe training and seen this slide? Okay, so you're really familiar with this slide, right? Okay, so we're organizing. If you look at it, there's 9 silos that are up there. If I use a basic communication formula, that gives us 36 communication channels with that. Now what I learned as I started my hardware journey, as we went through there, this little guy here, that hardware silo, one of the 9, there's a whole bunch here, and I only picked a few, right? I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, wow, I could expand the silos even more, right? I could go through. Well, what if I took one from each of those? I just took the 9, I expanded hardware, now I've got 17. That gives me 136 communication channels. We're trying to deliver value across 136 functional areas. You guys remember Dunbar's number? Sorry, Drew, I think I just messed with Dunbar's number. I kind of blew it out of the water. Now I've got one person from every area attending PI planning. But it speaks to the complexity of what we're trying to do and who needs to be involved. That's what we're really looking at. So we need to be thinking about that. How do we manage all of this? Well, first off, cross-functional teams. Software, maybe you had your dev, test, your BA, you had those kind of roles. Well, our Agile team, maybe it is, I mentioned before, we got power and electrical and mechanical. We have hardware techs, all on one team. Where's the hardware test and manufacturing test? So the point is don't box yourself in terms of thinking about, well, an Agile team, the 7 plus or minus 2. It has to contain the roles that deliver value. So don't feel like you're hamstrung by that. And even in the lower one where I say it may contain, I look at this now and I read it in my next, why don't I have software on there? I should have software on there too, because as we start looking at what are those integration points and how do we do it, we want to make sure that our Agile team has all the skills necessary. And very simple terms in terms of how we do this, because one of the challenges is say, yeah, but Duane, I can't, our power engineer is designing, and once they're done designing this initial thing, they've moved on to the next one. Well, we can keep the team together and keep those non-fungible roles and have alignment as we start acting as a true team. And we can support that long-lived cross-functional team. So I just took 3 roles, said I've got this enabler. You notice the timeline across the bottom is PI, so this is long-lived. These are 10-week blocks, right? So as we go through here, I've got this enabler. It's going to take me over 2 PIs to accomplish. And there we go, design, build, test to do all this in there, right? We're iterating PDCA. So I've got the power engineer, and maybe this line represents the work that they're doing within that enabler. And you can see it trails off. But then my mechanical engineer is kind of steady state, working throughout, right? And then hardware tech and test, maybe early on, there's not as much to do because we're still designing. But as we move down that paradigm and we start proving out and iterating, there's a lot more collaboration. And then what happens is, as more enablers come in, this cycle continues. We haven't broken the team up. We've maintained alignment. And now we also start getting those benefits like empathy and understanding, right? And anticipation and even career pathing. Getting better at what we do because we've stayed together and we've enabled ourselves that over time we're going to continue doing this as a cross-functional, high-performing team, right? So I know it's kind of a silly graphic, but that's really what we're looking at. And you got to think about it in that sense from our development team. What about the full Agile team, that Scrum Master and Product Owner? We absolutely must have these roles. Do not compromise. As someone who did, I'm a recovering compromise. We want to make sure that we have this in place. That Scrum Master role is so important. From the cultural aspects, I say up here, engineers want to be engineers. When you compromise, what you end up doing is saying, who can be the product owner? Well, you want to do, okay, great, you're voluntold, right? That doesn't work well. That's a job satisfaction, and it's a transformation killer. So the Scrum Master helps that coaching. We've chose that path. We're good at it. We know how to facilitate teams. We know how to stand up teams. We are going to help with that cultural change. So make sure those roles are accounted for. Make sure they're accounted for in the right proportion. One Scrum Master for 6 teams, yay! No, don't do that, right? So these are all parts of the considerations. And then the product owner, I put technical or business, doesn't matter. What do you guys think? Is there a difference? think about who our customer is, especially in some of the engineering ranks, who's consuming the work. We do have highly technical product ownership. And they can be extremely effective in our backlog management and how our teams run, because they're the proxy for the customer. So your context, your mileage may vary. Give it some thought in terms of that. But it's really important that we have the role in place, someone that does the care and feeding with the team in terms of what it is that we're developing, right? So that rounds out the entire Agile team. So you've got the dev team with those considerations, but then you also have the Scrum Master and Product Owner. All right, PI planning and incremental delivery. Just a fun little sketch there. You've heard Dean say this. This is, there is no magic except maybe for PI planning. And the key here is alignment. The key is alignment. So as we look at this, what do we need? Hey, how about socialized roadmaps? We must know where we're going. Has anyone gone into PI planning without understanding the path, but been told how long is it going to take for you to get there? What? That happens. How about a well-formed enterprise backlog? Has anyone gone in with newspaper headline stories? Yeah, it's scary stuff, right? So we want to make sure that we understand that, and that includes our enablers. That includes things like capacity allocation. You guys heard that in training? Did you go back and apply it? Because that's the other part. We talk about it, but we got to apply it. And then finally, how about aligning to a PI theme? What is it we want to take and get out of the next 10 weeks? The neat little thing on this slide is this is no different than any other PI planning, folks. So when we talk about hardware being different, we don't need to be. Our similarities are extremely similar, right? So we're looking at delivering value. So that's why these things all come into play. How about what is different, though? Remember those 136 communication channels? More channels means more contributors. As you're setting up your planning, we want to make sure that we account for it. So this means on that implementation roadmap, when we reach that tipping point, we need to be thinking systemically about all the folks involved, who's contributing value. And then we want to make sure, an invite is a great start, whether it be training or whatever it might be. But we really need to account for their roles, the ceremonies, expectations, even silly things like workspace. I had an art where we launched, and we had 12 teams, and we thought we had nailed it all. All of a sudden, there was 4 shared service teams that were kind of showed up in the corner that we didn't account for. And by the time we stood them up and created the physical space, and we were using the big 4x8 sheets of the foam board, if anyone's done that with mobile boards, works out really great. We had some extras, we stood them up. 2 of those teams, they didn't even have team names because they didn't go through Safe for Teams training. Big miss. I mean, we missed. Swing and a miss. By the time they were done participating in the 2 days, their board had more red Post-its on it that we call them the CSI team because it looked like a crime scene. Now, if you have that many dependencies on 2 teams and you didn't even give them thought, think about the aspect of a program dependency board if they hadn't showed up and participated. What would we have missed in our PI? Would we have been effective in anything going forward? So that's why I kind of point this out as we look at that Uber 136 channel. We really got to get ahead of that and make sure we've got everyone involved and accounted for. And I know we don't know what we don't know, right? But we learn from that. And hopefully a talk like this makes you rethink what you don't know. Oh, did we talk to fill in the blank type stuff? And then the last part of this here is the enablers. Make sure that we're accounting for those enablers. And even who's going to coach them, right? Because it's one thing to say, yeah, we've got to have this enabler to set up this infrastructure. Okay, what does that mean? Because that's the next question people often ask, right? And you're the RT, you're the coach, you're running around PI planning, and someone says, Duane, I need to explain this. Kind of take that step back and go, I don't know, right? So think about who's going to be coaching these teams as well, because it's not just the coach that helps with the mechanics and the culture, but it's also the what does it mean in my context. So this is part of where coaches meet you where you're at, right? Because it's easy for us to be thinking about that stuff, but you got to think about everyone and where they're on their journey. What about testing and system integration? So I mentioned this before. Our goal is still the same. We want to test early and often. But there are some greater considerations that we must have here. First off, from an environment strategy can be different. In today's day and age, we can spin up virtual environments a lot easier in a software world. We can't just spin up a work cell. Or, oh, you know what, the wind tunnel's used today, so I'm just going to go down and lease one. It doesn't work that way. I need a thermal chamber. Well, we have one. Here it is. Yeah, but I need one that I can actually roll the semi-truck in because I need to test it in this environment. Wow, that's going to require a specialty that's often a third-party vendor that works with a number of different areas. Do you think that there might be some date-driven aspects there? Because they're not just readily available on our whim to say, yep, I'm doing my thermal test today. Or we're doing the wind and water test today, right? So we have to have, this is where that construction roadmap helps pull some of these things in so that we can make sure that we understand it. I also put for bullet point 2 there, the cost of physical setup and test targets, right? Giving consideration to how many boards you're going to destroy, right? You're doing a printed circuit board. Say, okay, I got a lot of 100. How many are going to get destroyed in POC or in alpha? Well, hopefully, I can understand what that may look. How many am I looking to actually refurbish? Can I refurbish them? What are the levels of tests that allow me to go through, you know what, I can use this board in these series of tests if I run them in this way. Or, first time out of the gate, that board's going to be toast. It's going to validate or invalidate, and then we're done. That is a physical consideration that we must go through, and oftentimes we'll use a BVIR, Big Visual Information Radiator, for things like our physical assets. What are those? So that way you can go through and understand if a dependency board is great for teams to see where our integration points are and where our bottlenecks may be, where our risk is, where our WIP is, does it not apply to an environment management as well? We've tried to do in some cases where you'll have that dependency management board where you've got your teams running down with your PIs running across, right? Everyone's on the same page when I use that. We've tried to extend that sometimes with our environments at the bottom. Well, you end up with a board that's the size of that wall. And unless you're my height on this stage, you're not reaching the top stuff, right? So that's where having multiple boards really comes into play, and then also allows us to keep flow through the meeting as well. Because I don't know if you notice, sometimes your dependency management boards at PI planning can become a bit of a bottleneck, right? People are trying to get Post-its and yarn or whatever you may do on it. So that way it also helps you set up some disparate areas. So that way you can keep flow going through your meetings. How often should we integrate? Well, we got to have a base product. This is a pretty common question. If we integrate too early, we waste some of those learning cycles, especially if we're starting to talk about where we are doing any kind of destruction of a physical asset, right? Or potential destruction. If we integrate too late, then we wait. And I know some of the engineers I work with, and Raj, a good client, good friend of mine here back in the day of 2014, we had an engineer that very detail-oriented. And he wanted to make sure before he handed things to the teams that they were all buttoned up and perfect. So what that did was you got a really, really concise, detailed, well-mannered, well-formed, but it took a long time, right? So we want to get things in people's hands early and make sure that we can go through and not integrate too late and get that learning. And it is a balance. Your mileage may vary, but get to that base as quickly as possible. And then the use of models and simulators, again, digital twins, a number of different areas. Technology has come a long way. Recently, I was at an INA event where they were going through and doing the demo and using augmented reality on an iPad and flowing through with the entire room. And you could see the whole panel of what the structure would look like in play. And you could even flop out the various drives that were there. Could have never done it in a physical room like this, right? We weren't going to wheel the stuff in. But that was the type of thing that allowed the stakeholders that were there to be in the moment, to the point where they're like walking up, and it's kind of weird, because if you're not seeing the same thing they're seeing, it just looks like somebody pointing at a wall. But it's kind of fun in terms of that's a model and a simulator. And again, I want to bring you back to an earlier slide where we want to say, what do we want to learn from that? Right? What do we want to learn from this model? What is our hypothesis? We may be surprised at some stuff, but it's going to help us go through, and we want to use all of the various aspects. And again, I just threw some of them that are up here. Your mileage may vary. I'm sure there's a ton more in your head. But we really want to understand that testing early and often is going to be done through the use of models, simulators, and the technology at our disposal. All right, so a couple final thoughts here. I think you saw the transition, right? I led with 3 differences or 3 challenges that hardware have. But by the time I got to that PI planning and walk through the principles, it really applies the same, right? An agile team is an agile team. How we construct it might be different, but the principles and the practices are in play. So, first, get out of your own way. Agility applies, embrace it. I toyed, those of you who know me, I have a bit of a sense of humor. I toyed with leaving it up there or not. But I've said this so many times with my teams, because we want to argue some of those practices and principles over and over and over. And at some point you say, just embrace it. We are going to be so much better off if we grab on and go. So that's what we want to do, is embrace it rather than fight it. SAFE applies. The principles are the foundation. And as you go back to your organizations, if you're a coach, a practitioner, whatever it may be, when you're confronted with that wall, that decision point, whatever it may be, what principle applies and how can I apply it? Go back to those 10 principles. That's why they are there. They are tried and true. They help us in our decision making, because I'll tell you, as coaches, we're going to run into situations that we haven't been in before. And suddenly you go, okay, this is what I need to do. Hardware functions are extensive, so we need to be thinking about them all. And when we do things like SAFE for teams, we want to train everyone together, right? We want to be able to go through and have the teams defined and the teams trained together, and then we need those roles, and we need those roles filled in a proportional manner, right? We can't have the 1-to-6 ratio, especially when it's something that is brand new to an organization. We want to develop that construction roadmap, Luke, Horizon roadmap. This is that balance of early indicators versus are we on the right path, all right? This is the balance that's there. And then finally, cross-functional teams work. Leadership must understand this and support the new team structures. Those silos that we broke into 136, that's what I mean by the new team structure. We're taking those and boom. I wish I had the graphic Dean did this morning. That was awesome when he blew up the structure, right? Because that's what we're looking at, is how do we go through and do that. And that includes our scarce and our shared resources, because we have a lot of those, right? So let's make sure we understand that that's how it goes through and works. Pull it all together in PI planning, extremely important, right? Seminal event for SAFE, it works. We want to continue because that's the touch points as we go through that validates us along the roadmaps. And then finally, embrace those body of practices. We have the proven practices. We've got the case studies. You can look, there's 2,100 attendees at this conference that have a great amount to contribute. Let's go through and have the conversations and work together, and we can continue to evolve the hardware aspects of the framework as much as anything else. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. If there's any questions. And if there's one right up here. And then I will stick around after. I know we're going into our break. And then we also have the SBCT station and Icon Agility Services. I'll put a plug in for them as well. The coaches are excellent in this arena. Please.
Thank you. Great presentation. On the construction roadmap, 2 pieces of that. You mentioned procurement.
Mm-hmm.
I would think that would be a critical piece for the procurement piece.
Absolutely.
For that construction roadmap. Because I've done a little bit of work with some hardware teams, and their biggest piece was procurement.
Yes.
So constructing that construction horizon roadmap would be a critical piece, I would say, for them to understand.
Yeah, so if that's a critical piece, then think about who needs to be involved to inform that roadmap, right? Because if we need to start doing the N-1 backup, right? When's the last responsible moment? What do we need to learn? Can we lean it out and batch it? Those are the types of things that should be on that.
We need to train them as well.
Absolutely, and that's part of those 136 channels.
And did you do anything differently from a tracking those construction roadmap, or it just looked like it was just a longer period in time?
It's a longer period of time. It actually fits within that solution roadmap in the PI. What we did do is we tagged it within our backlogs. So by using whatever Agile Lifecycle Management tools you're using, you have the ability to do different tags and be able to pull it out from a custom report standpoint. That's what we did. So another question here. There, and then there's one down here as well.
Hi, I have a question. You mentioned on one release train you can have hardware and the other functions. If you have really large solution, would you recommend to do it still, like put the hardware in every train, or would have a specialized hardware train? And what are advantages and disadvantages of doing
Yeah,
that?
so I would experiment here, because if you create, say, like a platform train where you have hardware all in one, and then maybe your firmware and software are another train, just to keep things simple in that sense, you can create some bottlenecks, because now from a solution standpoint, your solution doesn't go out the door unless you have everyone communicating. So those handoffs between the trains becomes really important. Now, if you take those trains and you combine them and say, hey, we're going to go through and have our teams are truly going to be cross-functional, now we can get some speed going through, and the challenge then becomes the management of the scarce and shared resources, because then now you stress a different part, potentially, of the organization. And the nice part is, one of the things about SAFe, and I know a few of the coaches use this as well, is it shines a big spotlight. So whatever model you use as you start to go through, one, don't feel married to it. We iterate, right? So plan, do, check, adjust. We plan this route, we can adjust. But the spotlight will get shown in terms of, wow, that's an area of concern, because we're now stressing, we have a bottleneck that we're between firmware and hardware. And we're only aligning on our PIs, so that's presenting an opportunity that's actually pushing us out. We're not getting value delivery. Maybe we should consider reforming. So your mileage may vary. Experiment, see how it goes through, and then that's going to lead you to your current solution, if not optimal solution.
Thanks for the session. I had a question on how would you convince leadership on investing in R&D, more so for hardware than for software. And the reason why I bring that up is because you had a very good point on how do you integrate early, right? So simulators, they play an important role, right, in hardware. And a lot of innovation is needed, because today the practice is that they wait until all the vendors have provided all the chipsets and all the boards to integrate, and then the integration happens.
Yep.
So you have to invest a lot upfront in trying to innovate and build that environment where you could integrate early. So a company that is just starting off with SAFe or any kind of scaled agile framework, how do you convince them to make that upfront investment?
Sure. So when we look at our portfolios and look at what we're doing, we may have different products that are in the various areas of our life cycle. Well, at some point, we may know that our product life cycle is going to end of life at some point. And that's what R&D is looking to do, is say, okay, how do we get out ahead? What's the next thing? We need to integrate this as part of our overall portfolio, because it's not just one area that's R&D and then our engineering development trains, right? This is all part and parcel, needs to be together. So using things like capacity allocation and using the tools that are there so that we've got the investigative, this is the emergent versus intentional design, right? So the intentional design may be, where are we going with some of those R&D? Where do we see that? The emergent coming from our teams as we're developing that. So having a well-formed backlog that allows our leadership, so how would I educate? The question was, how would I talk to leadership? I would say, here are the areas that we're currently investing in, current product as well, and then the percentile, the capacity allocation that we're doing on those enablers, and then bringing them back to say, now, does that match up with what we're doing in PI planning? Does that match up? Are we carrying that percentage? Are we investing, or are we only looking to do our current state stuff? Because if we're only looking to do current state stuff, we have a disconnect in that portfolio, and showing that to leadership, they'll get it right away because we need to be doing it all along throughout our process. So this is the systemic nature of taking the economic view. So that's how I would show that in terms of what do you guys think we're investing in and how we're going to get there, and then is the rubber hitting the road with how we're currently executing our arts. Yep. Any other questions?
I
Thank
do
you.
have a question.
Oh, we got one.
You mentioned 136 communication channels, all these contributors. I live in this world too. What are the tips and tricks you see? Because we get boards just like your CSI board.
Yep.
We see like this blast radius. It continues to expand in our PI event. We have like 45 or 50 teams.
Mm-hmm.
What are tips or tricks that you might have or have seen to help us manage that alignment of that many groups together, but not make it a board that's the size of that wall?
Right. So the first tip is to start to, you've got to hone in on those various teams and say, what is it about you, what you do, that makes you either shared or scarce, right? And then start to look at, are there areas of things that your team is delivering that can be, other teams can do? Can a team solve what they're doing themselves without your team's interaction? And start to look for some of that low-hanging fruit. And then, quite honestly, the answer may lead you to, you know what? We need to expand this capability within our organization. We're 2 people that do compliance, and we're getting asked from all these different areas. Well, guess what? It's going to slow you down. So that's something that you go through. So you've got the heat map now. Now it's starting to hone in on those various areas to say, what are those things? And the number one thing I do is be meeting with the teams to say, what do you guys see? How can we help you in this interaction? And then what is it that would enable you to service more teams or not? Remember I said WIP is the number one thing? Maybe we have to scale back on that as well and give you more clarity of focus. If there's other questions, comments, concerns, I'll be available right to the side. Otherwise, thank you all for your time and attention.